The sun had just begun to dip below the horizon when the man pulled his car onto the edge of the neighborhood, his old, dust-covered Crown Victoria humming quietly as he eased it to a stop by the curb. The streets were mostly empty, save for a few kids kicking a ball in a yard 2 houses down and a couple of shadows leaning against a chain-link fence near the corner liquor store. It wasn't a place people passed through without reason, especially not alone, and especially not in that car. He stepped out slowly, surveying the area with practiced eyes, the car door shut with a metallic thud, echoing briefly before the stillness returned. A few residents glanced his way from porches and windows, but no one said anything. He didn't look threatening, and he didn't look scared. That was unusual. Most outsiders who wandered into this part of town either strutted in like they owned it or couldn't hide their nerves. He did neither. He tugged down the brim of his cap and adjusted the cuffs of his jacket. The vehicle he drove wasn't much a faded Navy sedan with a cracked taillight and a dent in the rear fender, but it was reliable and, more importantly, it didn't draw attention, or at least it wasn't supposed to. Tonight, it seemed like anything could draw attention, and it didn't take long. Not 5 minutes had passed before the sound of squealing tires cut through the quiet. A black and white patrol car rounded the corner sharply and stopped halfway down the block. 2 uniformed officers emerged, hands hovering near their holsters as they approached with purpose. Their boots crunched on the gravel as they neared. The man leaned casually against the side of his car, arms crossed, not saying a word. His expression was unreadable, almost bored. Step away from the vehicle. One officer barked, already scanning the car's interior through the windows. He didn't move. "Is there a problem, officers? No questions. We got a report of suspicious activity in the area. You match the description." The second officer said as he pulled a flashlight from his belt and began circling the vehicle. The man arched a brow. "Description of what?" "Sitting quietly by myself." That only seemed to agitate them further. The first officer approached with more aggression now, reaching for the door handle. "Pop the trunk." "There's no cause," he began, but his voice was cut off as the officer yanked the door open and started rifling through the glove compartment. The other moved to the rear of the car, tapping the trunk with the butt of his flashlight. "You got something in here we should know about." "I don't," he said evenly, "and unless you've got a warrant or a reason—" "We got plenty of reason," the officer snapped. The tension escalated fast, too fast. One of the officers muttered something about the car being reported stolen and outright fabrication. The man stood firm, calm as ever, but inside something turned. It was becoming clear they weren't interested in truth. They were making a scene, and worse, they were enjoying it. "Stand back." One of them said, "We're calling this in. Don't move." He didn't. He stayed rooted where he was, arms still crossed, watching as one officer pulled a flare from the cruiser while the other poured what looked like accelerant on the rear seat. The man's gaze narrowed, but he didn't stop them. "Not yet." The officer lit the flare, hesitation flickering for a second before he tossed it inside the car. Flames leapt up almost instantly, licking the edges of the door, then roaring through the interior. The heat pushed back the air, sending waves toward the sidewalk. The fire crackled, drawing more eyes from windows, more footsteps toward the street. Still, the man didn't speak. He just watched the flames. The smoke hadn't yet fully thickened when the officers turned their attention back to him, stepping in closer now that the car was engulfed in flames. One of them narrowed his eyes, clearly annoyed by how calmly the man had taken it all in. That kind of quiet unnerved certain types of people, especially ones who were used to being in control. "Where you from?" the taller officer asked, his voice clipped. "Out of town." The man replied, deliberately vague. "You know what goes on around here." The other officer chimed in, arms crossed, trying to project authority over the growing crowd forming along the sidewalk. "I've heard things," the man said without looking at either of them, eyes still on the burning car. "Doesn't seem like you've got it under control, though." That didn't sit well. The taller one stepped forward, clearly agitated. "You think you're funny. No, I think this is a waste of taxpayer money." he said calmly, turning his eyes toward them now. "You've just destroyed a registered vehicle without probable cause. You've made a public scene. You've escalated without investigation." The shorter officer flinched slightly at that last word, investigation. It sounded too deliberate, too measured. The man wasn't shaken, he wasn't afraid. He sounded like someone who knew exactly what they were doing. That kind of confidence only came from experience or power. But they weren't thinking straight anymore. The fire had rattled something loose. One had his hand hovering near his taser now, the other still trying to bluff his way into control. "This area's been crawling with gang runners, gun smuggling, stolen cars, you showing up like this. It's not nothing. I parked a car," the man said. "I didn't break any laws. Don't need a broken law to act when we think something's off." The taller one shot back. The crowd was bigger now, people pulling out phones, some filming quietly from across the street, others murmuring among themselves. The flames had taken over the vehicle completely, smoke rising high into the dusky sky, painting the block in orange flickers. Sirens could be heard in the distance now, more patrol units, or maybe the fire department. Hard to say. The man finally moved just a small step forward, but enough to make both officers straighten. He raised his hand slightly, not in surrender but in emphasis. "You've just burned a man's property on an assumption. No badge number given, no explanation, just aggression." The taller officer stepped closer, squinting now. Something about this wasn't adding up for him, but he still couldn't stop himself. "You got ID." The man gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "I do." "Well, then hand it over." The officer snapped, growing more impatient. He reached into his jacket slowly, deliberately, one smooth motion, and pulled out a leather wallet. He didn't rush. He opened it with both hands and held it up toward them. The shorter officer squinted at it, and for the first time that night, his face changed. His mouth opened slightly, as if to say something, but the words didn't come. The taller one moved to glance at it, and whatever he expected to see clearly wasn't what was in front of him. Silence. Tension clung to the air like the smoke still rising from the car. The taller officer leaned in again, closer now, this time not to intimidate but to be sure. His face drained slightly of color. The badge in the wallet gleamed under the street lamp, its detail unmistakable, its authority absolute. The kind of badge that didn't belong to anyone who could be pushed around. The man didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The taller officer took a single step back, but it felt like a retreat. His eyes stayed locked on the badge, unable to hide the way his jaw clenched. The shorter one stood stiff, as if frozen between instinct and realization. The fire behind them continued to rage, now roaring loud enough that the crowd murmuring around the edges of the street began to quiet down. Some had noticed the tension shift the same way animals sense the sudden change in weather before a storm. The man lowered his wallet slowly and slid it back into his jacket without saying a word. No smugness. No gloating, just the kind of calm that comes from knowing the damage had already been done, and nothing he said now could make it worse for them than they had made it for themselves. But the officers, they still weren't ready to admit it. Not fully. Ego can be louder than sirens when it's cornered. "Why didn't you say something earlier?" the taller officer asked, trying to inject some weight into his voice again, but it rang hollow. "I wanted to see what you'd do," the man replied simply. He turned to glance at what was left of the car. The flames had started to die down, leaving the vehicle a smoldering skeleton of melted metal and scorched rubber. The heat had warped the windshield into a distorted pane, cracked and blackened. "Do you know how much trouble this neighborhood has given us?" the shorter officer said, defensive now. "We're under pressure. We've had carjackings, weapons stashed in trunks, kids running stolen plates. We can't afford to take chances anymore. You didn't take a chance," the man said, turning back toward them. "You made a choice." That one sentence seemed to strike a nerve. The taller officer's nostrils flared. The shorter one looked away completely. "You think that car looked normal to us." The tall one pushed. "Old Crown Vic in this part of town. no plates on the front. It fits a profile. So does your behavior," the man answered, "and unlike the car, that's not the first time I've seen it." The silence after that was worse than shouting. They didn't know how to argue with him anymore, not when every word he said carried the weight of someone who had sat through too many debriefs, written too many internal memos, read too many citizen complaints. His eyes didn't need to search for flaws, they were trained to see them immediately. He stepped forward, this time walking past them, toward the remains of the car. The heat still radiated off it in slow, pulsing waves. He stood there for a long moment, watching as the metal hissed and buckled in spots, the flames now down to embers flickering in the frame. From the corner of his eye, he noticed one of them reaching for their radio. The dispatch call would be coming soon, maybe it had already happened. Backup, supervisors, someone to clean this up, but there would be no way to rewrite what had already taken place in front of half a block's worth of witnesses. The man turned slightly and looked at the taller officer. "You know what the real problem is," he said, quiet but direct. "It's not that you made a mistake. Everyone does. It's that you didn't care whose life you could have ruined in the process. You didn't care until you realized who I was." The officer didn't respond, neither did his partner. That was the part that made it worse, the silence that followed truth, because they both knew he was right. If he'd been anyone else, that car would still be burning, and no one would have blinked. There wouldn't be any questions, no accountability, just another charred accusation in a city already full of smoke. Somewhere down the block, a new set of red and blue lights approached, cutting through the dusk. But they were too late. The damage was already done. The man didn't move as the additional patrol units rolled in, tires crunching slowly over broken pavement. Their headlights caught the swirl of smoke curling upward from the shell of the burned car, casting long, shaky shadows across the sidewalk. Doors opened, more uniforms stepped out, surveying the scene with tight eyes and hushed words into radios. But no one approached him, not yet. They could feel it too, the weight in the air, the way everything was suddenly very wrong. He stood still, arms behind his back now, watching the fire fade. There was no anger on his face, no demand for explanation. Just that same quiet authority, colder now, sharpened by the silence that had followed the badge reveal. Around them the crowd had grown, held back only by the caution tape hastily strung by one of the new arrivals. Phones were still out, people were whispering. One woman on her porch was narrating the whole thing like it was the nightly news. "I told you." She muttered to someone beside her, "That man ain't just anybody." But the man didn't acknowledge her, or the dozen others now murmuring versions of the same thing. He didn't need the spotlight, didn't want it. What mattered had already happened. One of the new officers, older, heavier, stripes on his sleeve, finally approached. He didn't walk like the first two. He didn't swagger. He approached with caution, like someone entering a room after a fight has already broken out. His eyes shifted between the scorched vehicle and the man standing next to it. "Sir," the sergeant said quietly, nodding once, "may I speak with you?" The man didn't answer right away. He let the pause hang heavy before he spoke. "Go ahead." The sergeant glanced briefly at the two officers who had started it all. They were now standing off to the side, trying to blend into the background, but their uniforms made them stand out like blood on white linen. The sergeant looked back at the man. "I received a call from dispatch, confirmed your ID. I believe there's been a serious misunderstanding." "No," the man said, turning to face him directly. "It was an assumption, not a misunderstanding." The sergeant swallowed once, understood. His tone was respectful now, but it couldn't undo what had happened. The smell of burning plastic still clung to the air, mixing with something far worse, the scent of fear dressed up as authority. The fire was dying, but the damage remained vivid, impossible to ignore. A car destroyed, a reputation challenged, a mistake laid bare under public scrutiny. The man stepped past the sergeant, walking slowly around what remained of the vehicle. Melted metal dripped from the undercarriage. The dashboard was reduced to warped fragments. His gaze swept over it like he was taking mental inventory of every piece, every panel, every memory burned out of place. Still, he said nothing about the car. He turned again, this time looking at the people gathered across the street, some still filming, others just watching, waiting to see what would happen next. He held their eyes for a long moment, not to perform, not to posture, just so they knew someone had seen everything, someone who wouldn't forget. Behind him, the sergeant was already giving orders under his breath. Someone from internal would be called. The officers involved would be pulled from patrol, at least temporarily. There would be statements, reports, reviews, all the usual dances, but none of that mattered right now. The only thing that mattered was that the man stood calmly in front of a fire he didn't start, one that was meant to humiliate or intimidate, and he hadn't flinched, not once. He looked over at the two officers who had done it. Neither could meet his eyes, not out of guilt, not yet, but out of fear, the kind that grows when you realize your actions didn't go unnoticed, when you recognize too late that the quiet man you tried to corner didn't just have power, he had presence. And presence is something that can't be burned away. The sergeant's radio crackled again, low voices transmitting updates, but the tension was no longer in the background noise. It lived in the expressions of the two officers who now stood completely apart from the others. The shorter one had gone pale, his eyes darting between the smoking wreckage of the car and the man who had watched it burn. The taller one was still trying to hold a rigid posture, but the stiffness had turned to something else, shame trying to wear the uniform of authority. And then it happened. A single call came through, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Confirmed identity on that subject. Repeat confirmed, stand down, that's the sheriff. The words hit like a fist. The man didn't react. He didn't need to. It was the officers who felt it, visibly. The taller one's chin jerked down involuntarily, as if gravity had doubled. The shorter officer took a half step back without realizing it. The others nearby, new to the scene, still trying to assess the situation, stopped moving altogether. Conversations halted. The only sounds were the hiss of the fire cooling and the distant hum of another engine pulling up, likely fire services. The weight of their mistake rippled outward, a ripple that didn't just touch the two officers, but everyone in uniform on that street, because now they all knew what the crowd knew. They hadn't just overstepped, they'd scorched the property of the high, ranking law enforcement official in the county, and done it with no cause, no pause, and in front of witnesses. The sheriff finally turned his eyes on them. Not with anger, that would have been easier for them. There was no yelling, no threat, just the long, cold silence of a man who had been listening the entire time, documenting every word, every misstep, every act of ego. He had offered them the rope, and they had pulled it tight all on their own. The taller officer opened his mouth like he was about to speak, but nothing came. What do you say to a man whose car you just destroyed while accusing him of being a criminal in his own city? What excuse could possibly erase what had already been seen, already been filmed? The sheriff didn't wait for an answer. He walked slowly, deliberately toward them. The shorter one stiffened, his throat twitching. The taller one straightened again, but there was no confidence left in the posture. Just a uniform trying to save face. When the sheriff stopped in front of them, he looked at the taller officer first. "This the way you handle every stop?" he asked, voice low, but with the bite of someone who'd asked that question in courtrooms before. The officer opened his mouth again, struggling. "We thought, you didn't think," the sheriff said, cutting him off, still calm. "You assumed, and you escalated. You lit a fire literally, without knowing anything except what fit your narrative." He turned to the shorter one. "And you went along with it, didn't question it, didn't even ask for ID until after you lit the match." I didn't realize." The officer said, "No, you didn't care to realize." His words weren't loud, but they hit like blunt, forced truth, and behind them the crowd started murmuring again, not angrily, not loudly, but with that quiet churn of people who knew something had just shifted. They weren't watching a traffic stop gone wrong anymore. They were watching consequences begin to take form. The sheriff took a step back, surveying the scene once more. Burnt rubber, a vehicle reduced to scrap. Phones still out, still recording. Officers watching without speaking, waiting for someone to make the next move. He glanced down at the scorched pavement beneath his feet, then back up at the officers. Dispatch buzzed again, someone asking for a status update. Another officer started to answer but stopped when the sheriff raised a hand. The authority in that gesture was unmistakable. The street fell quiet once more.